Hi everyone, welcome to 24 War and Politics. Today I'm going to talk to British journalist and writer John Sweeney. I would like to discuss possible scenarios of Russia-Ukraine war in this year, strategy and tactics of Putin, and possible Russian attack on NATO. John, thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
More than 25 years ago, within the second Russia-Chechnya war, you were one of the first who publicly labeled Putin as a war criminal. Unfortunately, nowadays, a scenario repeats in Ukraine. I don't have any shred of doubt that you have been observing how Putin behaved all this time. In your personal opinion, when and under what circumstances Putin is ready to stop war against Ukraine?
Never. The problem is that if he stops the war, then Russia might wake up from its zombie sleep. And the Russian people will say, well, what the fuck was that about? Why have we lost more than 1 million people dead and maimed? Why have we spent so much money on this stupid war, which we're not winning anything like well enough that it's worth it. It's not worth it. So Putin's problem is the moment the war stops, then people in Russia might wake up and he's in trouble. So the reason why I believe the war will continue is that Putin knows that if the war stops, then he's in trouble. And by which I mean someone will kill him. So he doesn't want that to happen. His worldview is entirely focused on him staying in power for as long as possible. And we all saw that bit, which was overheard with him talking to Xi. And he's talking about not just longevity, but kind of living forever. And that's what's in Putin's mind. And I think the whole peace talk stuff, and I want to say to the fool in the White House, you're not understanding the man you're dealing with. Putin doesn't want peace. This is a game for him. It's not serious. And the war stops when the West finally gets real about the war and finally gets real about Vladimir Putin. And what we must do is support Ukraine with a sort of step change on the level and quality of our military aid and financial aid to Ukraine. And secondly, we need to enforce sanctions thoroughly and properly in a way that we haven't been doing it. We've been doing it half-heartedly. We've been pushing, cocktail sticks around the cocktail party as far as sanctions go. We need to start slamming down doors. We need to start seeing a lot of people going to prison for breaking sanctions. We need to see the Indians and the Chinese thoroughly and properly understand that if you trade with Russia, you do not trade with the West, full stop. And then Putin's in trouble. There were moments during the Battle of Kyiv when I can remember the Russian army was 12 miles away from the center of Kyiv. And it was genuinely scary. Now, here we are in 2026, and it's terrible. So many innocent Ukrainians, men, women, and children have been killed. It's terrible, and the killing continues. However, looking on the bright side, being an optimist, it's also true to say that Ukraine is still standing, that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian sense of democracy is, I think, brighter than ever. And actually, the shadows are lengthening in the Kremlin.
Yeah, actually, you have mentioned several tools how Russia can be defeated. But I would like to ask you, do you believe in any black swan event when it comes to Putin's fate and the end of Russia-Ukraine war? Because you have mentioned killing of Putin, but I mean something like the second Prigozhin's March or a kind of palace coup. Do you believe in it?
I was at Max. I mean, who wasn't fascinated by Prigozhin's March? And what was fascinating was when he and the Wagner army, they rode in from occupied Ukraine and they hit Rostov, and not a single FSB officer put up his hand and said, "Stop, this is mutiny." Nobody did that. And then they went all the way up. They got within, what, 100 miles of Moscow? I think what happened, this is my guess, it's an educated guess because I've been studying Putin for a long time, and I've written a book called Killer in the Kremlin, which thus far has not been translated into Ukrainian, never mind. But one day it'd be nice if it was. Anyway, I think that Putin's secret police got to Prigozhin's grandchildren, something like this. They disappeared. He heard them scream, or he heard his children scream with anxiety about where are the grandchildren. And Prigozhin said, "Okay, I'll stop." And then there's some kind of phone call. Putin says, "You're forgiven, don't do it again." And then a couple of months later, Prigozhin and his gang get in a plane, and the plane is shot out of the sky, bombed out of the sky. Whatever happens, Putin is a killer. Putin is a murderer. Putin is a psychopath. These are facts. I'd love it if Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump understood this. I don't think they will. I think they're being blinded by their own greed and stupidity. Black Swan event. It's possible, isn't it? I put my money on Deripaska, possibly Abramovich. He's never shows his hand, or even the people who run Gazprom. I think it's possible they can look at the number of people dead and dying and maimed. They can look at the billions squandered on this pointless and stupid war. They can look at the fact that Ukraine is still standing, and actually, militarily, Ukraine is getting stronger and stronger. And Trump's majesty is diminishing by the day. The American economy is not in a good shape, and that's the critical factor. The economy is stupid. It's the economy stupid. I think that Trump will lose, or the Republicans will lose badly in the midterms, and then it's possible, it's very, very likely that the Democrats will start ruling the roost in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And this means that Putin's ability to somehow kind of mindfuck Trump into bullying the Ukrainians, that is, the window for that happening is closing and closing and closing. So my view is that Putin is in trouble. I'm not saying he's dead yet, but he is in trouble. And if I'm a Russian oligarch, I would look at the numbers, I would look at Russia's future, and I'd begin to start calculating that it would be better, that there is no future, or the future for Russia is black, unless Putin is got rid of. And I think, and I can see that calculation taking place in people's minds.
By the way, how do Russian oligarchs feel in London nowadays?
Well, mate, I don't actually hang out with them. I did.
Fortunately or unfortunately, yeah.
I was, obviously, because it was the 4th anniversary of the big war. I was in Trafalgar Square. I was one of the people who was asked by the organizers to speak. I was wearing my orange hat. And I said, "Listen, my Ukrainian is terrible, but I do know one Ukrainian phrase you might know, and it's this: Putin."
Yeah.
But I think the Russian oligarchs, yes, there is. You hear Russian on the tube. Russian oligarchs don't take the tube, but they're here using kind of Maltese or other dodgy passports. They're here. And I think that they're calculating. Now, listen, if the war was going well for Russia, if it was absolutely clear that Trump was going to back Russia to the hilt, and that Zelensky was seriously damaged by the corruption allegations, and there was no replacement, no possible replacement for Zelensky, then my calculation will be, let's stay with Putin because Putin's going to win this war. None of those things are happening. Number one, Trump, as I say, Trump's room for maneuver, his grip on all the levers of power is weakening. Come November, he'll lost some of the big levers. Trump's in trouble, and what that means is his freedom to act against Ukraine in a bizarre and nasty way, the kind of thing that he did when he first met Zelensky properly in the Oval Office, or that moment when he was him and Vance bullied Zelensky. I don't think Trump can do that again. Secondly, the Europeans have got better, and the British as well, in terms of understanding what's happening here. Thirdly, I think that I can't see Russia defeating Ukraine. Now, I can't see Ukraine defeating Russia, but I can see Russia running out of money. Now, the big unknown here is the attitude of Xi, the Chinese, God, almost, you got to say, the Chinese president. So I think you can't, if you're in the Kremlin, if you're Putin, you can't say hand on heart, Xi is my friend. I don't think he is. I think, my enemy's enemy is my friend. No. I think with China, my enemy's enemy is also my enemy. And so I would worry if I was Putin, and I know a lot of Russians are worried about this, is the possibility that China is watching Russia bleed itself dry and become so weak there's a certain point at which China looks at it and says, you know what, we're not going to do Taiwan, we're going to do Siberia. And this was a war game. The Americans, the Pentagon, used to have a war game in the 90s where they would, where China would invade Siberia, and the Americans ended up fighting with the Russians to get Siberia back. Now, I can't see that happening. I can see Xi causing great trouble, probably not for Putin, but for who follows him. I can see that happen. I can imagine that happening. But you have to understand there is a big difference between the way Russia and China looks at the West. Russia's narrative, story to the Russian people, Putin's narrative to the Russian people is, you don't want to be like the West, we're all gay and transgender and it's all a mess. You don't want to be like the West. And the Chinese think the same, and they don't like our concerns about human rights and democracy in China, the whole thing, but also in Hong Kong, for the Tibetans, for the Muslims, in Xinjiang. But also there is a difference. For the Chinese economy to work, it needs Americans and Europeans and Brits to keep on buying iPhones built in China, all of that. And if we don't, then the Chinese economy is in serious trouble. And it's not perfect by any means. So I think that Xi will continue to play both ends, but I think he would be foolish to come down thoroughly on Russia's side, in particular, because it's clear that Russia is not winning. And by the way, I mean, I see the latest results. What's happening is the Ukrainians are now it's not masses of land, but they are picking up territory across the front line. And that's a narrative which must really irritate Trump and the other useful idiots in the White House. And it will certainly irritate the killer in the Kremlin and his cronies there, because what the hell is happening? The big story, Trump's story, is the Ukrainians have got no cards. Well, hold on a second. They've got something like the Jack of Spades and the Queen of Diamonds and maybe, the King of Hearts. They're doing very well for a player with no cards. That's true. That's true.
If I grasp your idea correctly, you count on midterm elections in United States and economic collapse in Russia for getting situation worse for Putin.
Yes, yes. Those are the two things. Now, separately, he's getting old. You know, he's an old man. And by the way, the gossip is that he said to all of his generals and his old buddies from St. Petersburg, from the gangster days, from Leningrad, don't retire. But these are old men. So he likes working with people he's known his entire life and seeing people. So his crew, his gang, are people he's known his entire life. And they're old. Some of them are starting to die. Some of them want to spend time with their grandchildren. Of course they do. They're human beings. And Putin is saying, don't retire. But he can't say to them, don't die. And at some point, some of them will start to die. And then what happens is that they'll be replaced. So a general will be replaced by somebody who's now a colonel or a young general who's 50, not 70. And Putin's afraid of these people because they're much younger men who might say, you know what, I'd quite like to be president. And they're the kind of people who will call up the guard, who will say, okay, we're going to storm the Kremlin. And then you've got the oligarchs, you know, so who pours Putin's tea? Has it been the same Char lady for forever, or is it somebody they can get at? And by the way, you know, I'm like, this is my educated guess, but the Ukrainians are getting pretty good at knocking off Russian officers who have clearly perpetrated war crimes. And then you think, well, like, oh, there's that guy, he was responsible for Bupa. The Ukrainians are getting very good at that. Now, if the Ukrainians can do it, so can some of the Russian oligarchs. And now, what do I think? I also think it's entirely possible that Putin can dial up the repression of the Russian state. So I'm not, by the way, I'm not speculating, or rather, I do not predict a Russian revolution. So I did Russian at school, and I had a love affair with Russia, a love affair which I now bitterly regret because of the inhumanity I've seen with which Russia has prosecuted this horrible war. And I know, well, for me, the killing starts with the Second Chechen War. That's the one I first saw the Russian army at play, if you like, in 2000. And it was hideous. Then there's the war against Georgia. There's a kind of proxy war where Russia sides with Bashar al-Assad against the Syrian people. Then there is the hideous stealing of Crimea and the eastern Donbass, and while the West go, well, it's okay, we don't do enough about that. And then the big war from 22 onwards. So, you know, there's the pattern of behavior. But I feel that it's possible that Putin can crank up the machinery of terror. In the course of reporting on Russia, I met 4 Russians who were critical of Putin. They were Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Esmerova, Boris Nemtsov, and Alexei Navalny. In order, poisoned, then shot, poisoned, survived, poisoned, died. So the message to ordinary people in Russia is, do not with the Kremlin or you'll end up dead. Like Anna, like Natasha, like Boris, like Alexei. So I do not think there will be a Russian revolution like there was in February 1917. I do think it's possible that there is a palace coup, or there could be a palace coup plotted by the oligarchs or plotted by a young general who's sick of this nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got you, John. Actually, I would like to expand our discussion in terms of Putin's way of thinking about his perception of war. What I mean, how do you understand current Putin's logic in terms of the war? I mean, what is he counting on when it comes to Ukraine's defeat? How is he going to win in his perception?
Are you going to ask any easy questions, Max? Because that's a real bugger. Listen, the whole war is crazy. I mean, I was talking about it to some friends just now, and I was in Kyiv when it happened for the big war, and I said to myself, well, this doesn't make sense because there's 200,000 people in the Ukrainian army at that time, February 22, and there's another 100,000 in the police and in customs, bits and bobs. There's 300,000 people with guns, underarms in Ukraine in uniform. So normally the ratio when you attack is that you would expect to lose 3 people for every defender you kill, 3-to-1 ratio. Therefore, Russia to take Kyiv needed an army of 900,000. But what happens if the Ukrainians are fighting like tigers and the ratio isn't 3-to-1, it's 7-to-1? Then Russia would need an army of 2.1 million. And I think it was more like that. But what Russia attacked Ukraine with was an army of 200,000, i.e. a tenth of the necessary number to achieve victory. Now, what Putin thought was that everybody in Ukraine kind of agreed with him that actually Russia was really Ukrainian, and therefore, and the idea of Ukrainian nationalism, Ukraine was its own country, its own nation, was silly, was a fairy story, wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. Remember when Ukraine voted for independence, your listeners will know all this, but essentially every single oblast, including Crimea, where there were a lot of Russian officers enjoying the sunshine down there, they all voted to join Ukraine, for the ending of the Soviet Union, to join Ukraine. Every single oblast, obviously the heavy Ukrainian patriotic communities to the west, the numbers were massive. But even in Crimea, it was more than 50%. So Putin's start point for the war, the big war, was based on a fiction, was based on nonsense, a fairy story. The problem is that there is nobody around him left who can say, listen, boss, that's not going to work. I think the one man who got it was, who's the head of the SVR? Is it Natrushin? Am I pronouncing him correct? This is the head of the intelligence service, the SVR, who 4 years ago, there was that big sort of crazy meeting of Putin and his advisors in the Kremlin. Mm-hmm. And he went around the table, who's in favor of the special military operation?
Yeah.
And it's Natrushin. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Could you repeat this?
It's the head of the SVR. I think
it's Patrushev.
It's Patrushev. Yeah.
Patrushev.
So
yeah.
Patrushev. He's the guy who hesitates, who stumbles, who gets he's the actor who gets his line wrong. And the story about Patrushev is he knows, he's got good intelligence about the Ukrainian attitude, and the Ukrainian attitude is they're going to fight. And Putin got it into his head that they weren't. This is the head of the SVR. That's why that's why I'm talking about the guy who was nervous. And maybe it wasn't Patrushev, maybe it was somebody else. Anyway, the question is what's happening now? And I think that Putin continues to be told fairy stories by the people around him. Remember, he doesn't use the internet. He doesn't properly understand the 21st century. He'd like the world to go back to 1975 or something like this when he joined the KGB. That's when the world was good as far as he's concerned. So this guy, there's and this is a sort of ziggurat. So the Kremlin is run like a ziggurat, not like a neural computer. Now all the smart AI stuff, the good commanders in war are open to information from wherever it comes. Now you've got to assess it and weigh it. But what you don't do is get yourself locked into a sick thing that you only hear what you want to hear. Putin's problem is he's only hearing what he wants to hear. So, for example, Putin boasts that the Russians have got Kupiansk. And then, the next week, guess what? Zelensky pops up and there's Kupiansk in the background because the Ukrainians have got Kupiansk back. And Putin could only make that mistake because the generals around him are telling him what he wants to hear. At some point, Max, there's going to be a moment, and I'd love to be a fly on the wall when it happens, when Vladimir Putin does a kind of reprise of the great scene in Downfall, when Hitler says, where's our Sixth Army? And then one by one, his pathetic creeps and yes men have to say, there isn't a Sixth Army. And then Hitler goes nuts. At some point, Putin is going to learn the truth. The problem, of course, is that the people who are telling him things, his information stream, is poisoned. So he doesn't understand what's happening. And the way to end the war is to deliver Ukraine the material, the weapons, the machinery, so that they can crush the Russian army in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then, and only then, will Putin get it.
Yeah, actually, I didn't want to interrupt you, but now when you have finished, I would like to correct you a bit, because when it comes to Patrushev, he's former head of FSB, secret intelligence. But when it comes to person you have mentioned, it's Naryshkin.
Yes, it's Naryshkin.
Yeah.
I was saying Naryshkin. Yeah.
Yeah, he's Naryshkin. He is the current head of SVR.
Yeah. So Naryshkin in 2002 says he stumbles his words, and the reason for that, I've been told, is because he knew it wasn't going to work. He knew the Ukrainians were going to fight, but he didn't want to say so publicly because he's being filmed. And so the reason he goes,
yeah. We all remember his appearance. Yeah.
Yes. So he got it right, but this is Putin's calamity, is that none of the people around him dare tell him things he doesn't want to hear. So that, in a sense, is the answer to your question. What is Putin's how does he see Ukraine losing this war? The problem is he thinks he's still winning because the people around him daren't tell him. Now, where it becomes kind of obvious, if somebody drops a big drone bomb on the Kremlin, and I know there's a problem with that, is that Trump wouldn't like that. Yeah. So at the same time, Trump's not around forever.
Yeah.
I'd like to, my own little private fantasy, by the way, is I've been to the Kremlin once after the poisoning of Litvinenko, and I asked Dmitry Peskov, Putin's PR guy, a difficult question, which was, Litvinenko said that Putin was a paedophile. Is that true? Peskov replied, no. And the mood music in the meeting wasn't great. I was a reporter of the BBC Panorama. When I say the mood music wasn't great, it was icy. But anyway, I walked out of the Kremlin. That's the last time I've been inside the Kremlin. But I'd like to come back. I'd like to ride into the Kremlin on the top of a British Challenger tank driven by Ukrainians. And I'd like to say, woo, I'm back. Now, that's probably not going to happen. But what could happen is that there is a moment when the Russian economy cracks. Now, at the moment, it's you can feel it beginning to crack, but it hasn't cracked massively. What I'm looking for is not just one bank, but 4 or 5 runs on banks. These are the things that caused the Great Depression, where you have sort of catastrophic bank failures, and people sort of going to the ATMs and they can't get money out. And then you've got a kind of social collapse, a collapse of order. Then you start getting big rebellions in the Muslim south, in Chechnya, but probably Ingushetia first, with the Buryats out in the east, trouble on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and a kind of silence. What Putin does when he's in trouble is he goes quiet. And the moment, to be honest, Max, I'll start cracking open the champagne, is when Russia 1 plays Swan Lake.
Yeah, I got you. And actually, the next question, I mean that I understand that economy is one of the most important factors, but actually, let's take into consideration situation on the ground, I mean on the front line, geopolitical factor, as you mentioned, economic possibilities, but not only of Russia, but also of Ukraine, both of them military power and human resources, and compare all of this. What possible scenarios of Ukraine-Russia war for upcoming year do you forecast when we compare all factors which I mentioned?
So you consider me like a gypsy lady with my magic ball going. Okay, I'll do that.
No, actually, I believe and appreciate your expertise, and I would like to hear from you your forecast.
I'm mocking, but I did say in the paperback edition of my book Killer in the Kremlin, I did predict that Russia wouldn't use tactical nuclear weapons, and the primary reason for that, well, there are two. The first is that if you drop a nuke in Ukraine, the wind blows west to east some of the time, and you'll have heavy radioactive contamination of Russia too. And so that's a game changer. But the second reason is it will tank the world economy, and the Chinese will hate that. And the Chinese have said, I can remember, and vividly, I was in Kyiv, I was in Babi Yar for the anniversary of Babi Yar in September 22, and I can remember the first person to say it would be wrong for any kind of nuclear adventurism, and of course the Ukrainians don't have nukes, was the Chinese head of mission, or the deputy head of mission at the Chinese station in the United Nations. Then the foreign minister said it the next day, and the day after, Xi himself at some kind of Tyrants Are Us convention said, no, we're not doing this. But in my book, I did say that I think it very likely that the Russians might blow up the dam. What was it called again? The dam down south, not far from Kherson, when they blew up the dam.
Kakhovka.
Yeah. I predicted in my book that the Russians would blow up the dam, and lo and behold, the Russians blew up the dam. So I am actually a fortune teller. And so this is my prediction.
A kind of, yeah.
I've got previous for it. So I think that the war doesn't change dramatically. I might be wrong. There could be a black swan event. It doesn't change dramatically, but that's good news for Ukraine. I think that that, by the way, it was a great thing that Zelensky got rid of Yermak. And I think General Bogdanov, as the chief of staff, he's very good and very sharp. And also the new defense secretary, who I've met at I met him once at some fancy restaurant in Kyiv. But these guys, they're young, they're absolute patriots, and they haven't got a whole series of skeletons to hide, which Yermak did have. So I think that the big picture is the war doesn't change very much, but the Ukrainians start doing better. Secondly, the Germans, when Germany makes up its mind about something, it goes for it. And that in particular, German military aid to Ukraine, and also Scandinavian and Baltic military aid to Ukraine will start arriving in numbers. And also French, British, German, Scandinavian, and Baltic missile technology and drone technology will help Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine is helping itself. And one of the other things, listen, I believe we should, in Britain, we need to tear up our defence review completely. We need to write an entirely new one, which does big things to things like that our generals and admirals really like, such as we have great big aircraft carriers. Well, what's the point of that if they can get sunk by, as we've seen, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is in the bottom of the Black Sea. That's not good. And the reason it is because of Ukrainian drones. Now, we need to start copying that technology. Tanks, I don't think work anymore. I really don't think they do, because of drones, because you can see what's coming. Now, by the way, all of these, now, of course, what happens is at the moment Ukraine gets an advantage, the Russians see it, they talk to their Chinese business partners, the Chinese come up with something, a copy of what the Ukrainian technology, and then the Ukrainians lose their advantage. At the moment, the Ukrainians have got a bit of an advantage because the Russians have been knocked off Starlink. At some point, they're going to catch up again, or the Chinese will come up with their own version of Starlink, but not that quickly. So on the front line, I see that I kind of predict, but it won't change much, but there will be a degradation of Russian military technology compared to Ukrainian military technology, and that works in Ukraine's favor. I'm not predicting a massive change. If you like, there are three fronts, or three great battlegrounds. There's the front line, there's the cities, and then there is the economic war. So in terms of the front, it doesn't change that much, but I predict I expect that Ukraine starts doing better, and more military aid and better military aid produced by the Europeans will start landing, and that will start helping Ukraine. Secondly, in the cities, I think that because the war is going in Ukraine's direction, and because Trump's ability to screw around and to undermine Ukraine is becoming weaker, that the Americans will start resupplying Ukraine. The Europeans will pay for that. But also European military missile technology, anti-defense stuff will get better. And also Ukrainian air defense technology will get better. So I'm optimistic in terms of the appalling loss of life we've seen in Ukraine will go down. However, historically, I've got to remember that during the London Blitz, 1940, I think the worst day, 1,300 Londoners were killed by Nazi bombs in the spring of 1940. There's never been a day in Kyiv where there's been anything like that. I mean, the worst days are something like 20 or whatever. But normally what you see is 4 or 5 people being killed. Now, this is far too many. and Western technology could prevent it. And what's happened is that Trump's been cheating or been holding this stuff back. But down the track, the Ukrainians and the Europeans are going to make good for the Trump deficit, but also I think Trump will be under pressure to resupply. So I'm an optimist about that war. And the third war, and I'm much more optimistic about this, is that the power of the American and European economies to outperform the Russian economy is absolutely true, and also true of the Ukrainian economy. So difficult as it is, difficult as it feels, Ukraine has survived this last winter. And on the free fronts, I see Ukraine doing better across all three. The critical one is the economic war, because if Putin's ability to pay for the war is radically diminished, then it means he can't give these, $50,000 bribes to soldiers or 18-year-old kids to join the Russian army and get killed by the Ukrainians 3 weeks later. If he doesn't have the $50,000 because there's been a run on the banks, and what they've done, by the way, is they've been telling Russian banks to give soft loan to defense companies so that they're off the books of the Russian economy. So what the reality is, the numbers that you see of the Russian economy are a lie, and there are many more numbers which are red, not black. But what they've done is they've hidden that by telling the banks, if a military company knocks on your door, you give them a loan, come what may. They've loaned too much. There isn't enough money as security in the banks. And so some of these banks are going to crash at some point. And there's only so much you can do inside a country like Russia to hide that fundamental truth. And if Putin runs out of money, then he's going to start running out of people to fire bullets, and he's going to run out of drones and bullets to put in guns. And then he's in trouble.
Yeah, I got you, John. Am I right that you are those person who believes that Trump is Agent Krasnov? I mean that he is dependent on Russian secret intelligence.
No, I'm not. I'm not 100%. Well, I don't think he's Agent Krasnov. I don't think he's reliant upon Russian intelligence. I think he's a sexaholic, and if you're a sexaholic, then you're exactly the kind you are a number one target for the Russian secret police. You just are. So I think it very likely that my friend Christopher Steele, the former head of the Russia House at MI6, is right when he wrote this report, or he had sources, good Russian sources, telling him that the Russian secret police, the Russian intelligence machine, had sexual compromise on Trump. I think that's likely. I also think that Trump is in sympathy. He likes the dictators and he doesn't like the Democrats. He doesn't like democracy that much. But I also think that Trump doesn't have that much room for maneuver. And by the way, and it's weird because Trump is also, he's very proud of his British roots. He's very proud of his Scottish mother. And actually, he really, it seems like he really likes our King, Charles III. And Charles is good about Ukraine. And when Zelensky got bullied, one of the very first people he saw was Charlie in Sandringham, and Trump had been rude about the fact that because of the war, Zelensky, out of honor to the people who are risking their lives at the front line, hasn't worn a suit. He's worn a kind of uniform. And there's the king looking pretty good, actually, as an English king, and there's Zelensky in his not in the suit, and you think, good on you, King. So Trump's got the mind of a goldfish. Like the Russians may get at him, and then one trip round his goldfish bowl, and then he forgets that the Russians have got at him and he's doing something else. So I'm not 100% convinced that Trump's conduct is entirely that of a creature wholly owned by the Russian secret state. I think it's possible they've got some sexual compromise on him. By the way, one version, Max, is, my girlfriend asked, I was having a drink with a former Western intelligence officer, and my girlfriend asked if it's Trump having sex with some Russian prostitute, some 23-year-old woman, who's going to say, who gives a damn? It's not going to humiliate Trump. That's not a hold. And this person, the former Western intelligence officer, said, yeah, but what happens if it's a man? MAGA wouldn't like that. By the way,
or younger girl.
Or a younger girl, or something very dark. Another version of this is what happens if they're having a threesome. Trump, the man, and a woman. And the Russians have edited out the woman. Now, we're slightly getting into we're getting into a slightly surreal thing, but it's absolutely true that Trump is a sexaholic. And by the way, sexaholics are people who want to have sex with. Does it matter who they're having sex with? It just matters that they have sex, and I would imagine that Trump likes to dominate. So, those scenarios, we all know the Russian secret police, the Russian intelligence service would know what to do with something like Trump. But I don't think, so his actions have been favoring the Russians, and the pressure on Zelensky to negotiate is serious and consistent, negotiate in a stupid way. However, I don't think it's an absolute fact, and I'm open to the possibility that Trump would just like the war to stop, so that he can win the Nobel Peace Prize. And it's not. So my mind is open to this other possibility that Trump isn't a Russian agent. And by the way, it's possible the Russians have got something on him sexually, and that Trump's aware of it, and so he behaves in the way he does, but it doesn't rule all of his mind. And remember, he's a politician inside, a democracy, and he doesn't have all the levers of power. He can't do everything he wants to do because there are other people who have to carry out his orders, and some will say, we're not doing this. What's fascinating is Rubio, time and time again, goes, yes, boss, and doesn't quite deliver. And you can feel that Rubio is the guy inside the room who's standing up for Ukraine. It's but also at the same time, Witkoff has met Putin 8 times, and he's been to Moscow 8 times. He hasn't been to Kyiv once.
My last question. Several months ago, we were observing the situation when Russian drones and fighter jets violate NATO airspace. It was a kind of intimidation and checking how organization would respond. I think that Putin got a clear signal about NATO's indecision. How would Russia provoke and distract NATO further? Because we see attempts to blur NATO's unity, political interference, and other tools of hybrid war. But everything is supposed to develop. How could events develop? How could events develop in this context?
You've got to worry about it. Obviously, if I was Putin, I'd go for Estonia. I would, there's something like a 40% Russian minority in Estonia. A lot of them, again, the Soviet officers who like the fact that this is a functioning economy, or a half-functioning economy in Soviet times. And it's very, very close. And then you can imagine Trump saying, we're not going to war to help the Estonians. but I can equally imagine the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians and the other Baltic states and Poland and Germany and us in Britain and the French and the Italian and pretty much all of the big players in NATO, the big fighters of history, saying, we're not having this. I also feel that Trump will be under tremendous pressure from the Republican Party when he needs their help. For example, he needs their help to keep him out of prison. I think that he will, circumstance will force him. So my sense of this is I'm not, I don't think Putin will attack NATO because he can't be sure that NATO, including the Americans, will see this as a crossing of a line in the sand. And that's my sense of it. Now, the problem with calculating Putin's next move is that, according to my book, according to my own research, I did, find reports of a KGB study of Putin. There was a report on him that said we can't give him a good job. So he graduated from the KGB Academy, and he was fluent German speaker, good working class background. So give him a proper job, and they didn't. And the Litvinenko said that he was a paedophile. Now, actually, I don't think that's well evidenced, and it's a terrible allegation to make against someone, even someone like Vladimir Putin. And I don't think it's based in fact, though I've seen that awful scene where it's on video, look it up on YouTube. Putin kisses boy on stomach. That's weird and creepy. It's not proof that he's a paedophile. I think Litvinenko was wrong to conclude that. I do think that it's likely that his KGB teacher gave her a bad report saying that he takes reckless risks. So the problem with calculating what Putin does next is Putin's got previous for taking reckless risks. So he could attack NATO, waiting to see it fall apart. I'm worried, obviously, we should all be worried about Trump's reaction, in particular, if Trump truly is Agent Krasnov, absolutely under the thumb of the Russians. But I think that Trump's in trouble if he behaves in that way. Like, I can imagine him getting into serious trouble in Washington if he doesn't defend the NATO line. But I also think that the British, the Germans, the French, the Norwegians, the Scandinavians, the Baltics, the Poles will really come to Estonia's aid. So Putin, you can't rule out the possibility that crazy Putin might attack NATO. But also, I think the NATO response from the European and British response will be tough and strong and good. Part of me wants this to happen, because then it becomes, my argument with people who favour, or rather who are soft on sanctions. That argument goes out the window. They're now attacking one of our NATO allies. Go on, do it. Let's see what happens. But I do feel, there's a problem. I feel this because I first saw Russian army war crimes 25 years ago, and that's when 25 years ago I called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. But there's a by-election happening in Manchester at the moment, and I was worried there's a Reform UK party, and the leader of that, Nigel Farage, he talks about Ukrainian corruption, but never Russian corruption. He talks about, don't poke the bear. He talks Kremlin narratives, does Nigel Farage. He would deny that he's a big supporter of Putin, but he has said that he admires him because he's an operator. So I'm worried about him becoming next prime minister. I get it, but I'm not sure enough people in my country, and my country supports Ukraine, get it. My feeling is Putin won't do it, but with this guy, you can never be sure.
Yeah. John, first of all, I would like to say you that it was really interesting. Thank you very much for this interview, and have a good day. Keep in touch.
Very good. And once again, as I said at Trafalgar Square, Putin. But also, I have a simple message to Vladimir Putin, and it goes like this: Vladimir Putin, do.
Thank you for supporting Ukraine.
Pleasure.